Hello and welcome. My name is Sue Miller, and I'm the Educational Director of the Child Study Center here at Wellesley College, and I'm delighted to see all of you here tonight. This event marks the end of our last formal celebration of the Child Study Center's 100th anniversary year. The Child Study Center is a laboratory preschool on the Wellesley College campus. It's one of the nation's oldest laboratory schools, serving as a model preschool for young children, a research facility for faculty and staff, and is also a training institution for Wellesley students and teachers in the greater Boston area. I would also like to thank tonight the Psychology Department, the Education Department, and the Sociology Department for co-hosting this event this evening, so thank you very much. We've had a banner year this year of lectures, fairs, educational and research displays, and of course cake for our 100th birthday celebration. No preschool would be complete without that. And this evening's speaker, Joan Almon, is the perfect culmination for our celebration. Joan is the co-founder of Alliance for Childhood, a research and advocacy organization with a major focus on restoring play in children's lives. She writes and lectures all over the world on children's healthy development, creativity, and playful ways of learning. Her mission is one we try to embody at the Child Study Center, even as the trends in early childhood education push toward didactic forms of instruction that run counter to the research on how young children actually learn. Tonight, Joan's talk is titled Encouraging Adventure, Redefining Success to Include Risk. It's my great honor to introduce Joan Almon.
Thanks, Sue. Well, thank you. It's a great honor to be here at Wellesley. And what a beautiful day you ordered for us. It was just great. I walked around a lot of the campus and enjoyed the lake, enjoyed the beautiful buildings, and enjoyed the students who were out enjoying the weather. So it was really lovely, lovely afternoon and lovely to be here. And actually a wonderful morning over at the Child Study Center. That was great. Well, we're going to talk about risk. And I was thinking today, you know, the students, tomorrow's the last day of class, then come finals, so we can all just relax and talk about this easy topic tonight of risk that gets everybody slightly alarmed whenever I use that four-letter word. But it used to be that when I would talk about play, people got alarmed. They immediately thought about chaos and I don't even know what all, but it was definitely described to me over and over as a four-letter word. In fact, when we started our campaign to restore play, many people said to us, whatever you do, don't use the word play. And we had to really think about that, and we couldn't find any other word that captured play. So we decided to stick with it. And then it wasn't too long after that that the American Academy of Pediatrics came out with its first report calling for play for children. And they did not mince words. They just called it play. So we felt sort of vindicated at that point. But now play is fairly accepted. That doesn't mean that it's frequently seen in children's lives, but the idea of play is now widely accepted. The new challenge actually has to do with risk. And there's a lot of fear around risk, a lot of a sense that children don't know how to handle risk. Well, it's a little bit of a catch-22. If you don't give them a chance to meet risk, they don't know how to handle risk. And yet, innately, children have a strong sense of how to handle risk. They just need to be given opportunities to exercise their own risk assessment. There was a lovely experiment done quite a few years ago now where 6-month-olds were put on a piece of plexiglass and under it was painted a checkerboard, and about halfway down there was a drop in the checkerboard, and the experiment was to see if they had depth perception at 6 months and could recognize that fall in the checkerboard, and indeed they could recognize it. And they stopped, and many of them then sort of tested the plexiglass, right, to see if it was safe to keep going. Some of them backed off, but many of them tested and then went further. And so it was concluded from that that actually not only could they have depth perception, but they recognized risk when they saw it. And that's what happens with children. Children actually do recognize risk and act accordingly. Now, some are a little foolhardy, some are overcautious. You get a lot of variations on how children handle risk. But they don't ignore risk. They recognize risk, and we'll talk more about that. But risk and play, one could say, go together, hand in hand. Creativity is part of that family, imagination is part of that family. They all go together. And if we cut off risk, you cut off a lot of play. I suppose one could play board games or something and feel it's not too risky, although some people become very competitive in board games. But, you know, in terms of physical risk, if you don't want children to exercise any physical risk, you pretty much can't let them physically play, because children take chances in play. Children are forever stretching the boundaries in play. They're forever trying out new things in play. Can I go higher? Can I dig deeper? Can I run faster? Can I go over that log, over the stream, or that plank that's out there? You know, what can I do? What are my abilities right now in this moment? And children discover that those abilities have changed from the last time they tried it, that they're often much more capable now than they were before. In play, children are forever stretching themselves, and with that comes a certain amount of risk. Hence the Band-Aid industry, which has caught on that children love Band-Aids, and they love colorful, playful Band-Aids, and they don't mind scratches and scrapes and even the occasional splinter. Nobody likes to have a child break an arm or a leg, of course, but in fact they heal very quickly. And a broken bone for a child does not have the same gravity that it has for an older person, where the healing process is much slower. So I'm not advocating for children to break bones, but I would also say it's not the end of the world when that happens. We used to tolerate more risk for children, more injury when that happened. Nothing serious, nothing that would have lasting effects, nothing like sports injuries, for instance, which we tolerate to a very high degree. Something like 750,000 children go to emergency rooms every year for sports injuries, some of which have lasting effects. And I'm not trying to speak against sports, but only to say that in certain areas we tolerate risk much more than we do in open-ended free play, where the least injury makes us very concerned. Well, risk also has social dimensions, and I want to talk about that a little bit, and then I'll come back to children's play and risk. In the world of risk, I find huge inconsistencies, frankly, in this country. I think we've become very risk-averse. We don't want to let children take chances, but we take chances on behalf of children a great deal. And what do I mean by that? About 20 years ago, I went to a large conference at the University of Maryland on computers and young children. And there was a professor from Bank Street who spoke, and she was clearly in favor of computers and children, but she was saying, look, there's research that needs to be done before we dive into this. And she had a list of questions that she felt had to be answered before we just opened the floodgates and let children have computers in their lives. Well, a year or two ago, a couple of colleagues and I wrote a little booklet called Facing the Screen Dilemma: Young Children, Technology, and Early Education. And it's on our website, which, by the way, is allianceforchildhood.org. So it's fully there. And we surveyed the research, and there's a lot of research about television in young children. But here it was 20 years after I heard that talk, and there is still almost no research about the impact of computers on young children. And now we've gone way past computers. Of course, we're in the land of tablets and iPhones and so on. We have no idea what the long-term effects are going to be. But we are eager, many of us, not myself personally, but many in our culture are eager to get our children acclimated to technology at the earliest possible point. And one of the things we learned in doing this is that although the American Academy of Pediatrics has really warned against technology screen time for children under 2, the rate of use of screens for children under 2 has increased enormously and will probably continue to increase, judging by how many parents I see on airplanes handing things to their little ones to keep them quiet. And I have a certain sympathy for that, I have to say, especially as a passenger who's happy for a little peace and quiet on the plane. But you know, whatever happened to nursery rhymes? Nursery rhymes are one of the great pacifiers of early childhood. Children love them and they calm down immensely. And I never hear parents using nursery rhymes to calm their children. I just see them handing them the phone or the tablet. There's a lot of things we can do in lieu of technology for young children to give their own imaginations a chance to develop before they have to digest everybody else's imagination. And for me, the most creative aspect about technology is the minds who create the programs for children. But I don't feel those programs enhance the children's creativity. That's a different story. And what we've seen in recent research is that creativity levels in this country are going down at the same time that the business world is saying that the #1 thing they're looking for in young employees is creativity. Well, not just young employees, and all their employees. So the 21st century business world is saying we need heightened levels of creativity, and the scores on creativity tests are going down. And I just learned today that Massachusetts is planning to do an assessment of creativity of children and sort of grading schools on how creative their students are. It sounds like an oxymoron, but it at least indicates that people understand that creativity is an important value, and it is. It's so fundamental to human life to be creative, and we're all creative. I remember, however, at age 17, 18, when I graduated high school, thinking, well, now they've knocked every bit of creativity out of me. You know, I wasn't quite sure who the they was or why they would want to knock my creativity out of me, but I was fairly clear that my education had done that. Fortunately, my college education helped awaken it again. And what we're seeing while I'm on the subject of creativity is that when I asked the researcher who had tracked the decline in creativity, a researcher at William & Mary College, what had happened in the year or so after she published her research, it was in Newsweek and all sorts of places, what kind of feedback did she get? She said no one from the education world contacted her, but the business world would not let her alone. And business schools wanted her to help them develop courses that would develop creative thinking in their college students in the business courses. And she saw the full irony that here we were so busy taking creativity away from children in the form of play, for instance, and now we were trying to bring it back in college students. Well, as I said, there's a lot of inconsistencies in the world that we've created for children. Another one that I'll mention, it's not directly related to risk perhaps, but it's very much on my mind these days, has to do with the fact that we've reorganized kindergarten education in this country and increasingly preschool education to allow time enough to teach children to read in kindergarten. This is not the most natural time, if I could put it, for children to read. But we're convinced as a nation that if we can get children to read at 5, they will be better readers later. And they will avoid the pitfalls, which are serious for children who can't read. The real goal is for children to read by the end of 3rd grade, but the assumption is the earlier you start them, the better. The problem is that there is no evidence that that's true. There's evidence that if you teach kindergartners to read for a couple years, they'll do better than children who learn to read in 1st and 2nd grade, but by 4th grade, any differences have pretty much disappeared. And on the well-respected PISA exam, which is given to 15-year-olds around the world in the 65 or so wealthiest countries, If you look at the top 12 scores for the countries, you'll see that 8 of those countries start formal instruction at 6.5, 2 of them at 6, and only 2 of them start before 6. The US is not one of the top 12 in literacy, but it does start children reading before 6. And again, there's no particular reason for doing this other than a belief. There's no data. It's purely a wishful thought, a belief, a hope that if we can get all our children reading early, they'll do better. And that will help them, and it will help all of us because we will soar economically. And my feeling is we already know what it's like to soar economically. Could we now soar humanly, creatively, and in other ways? So in the Alliance for Childhood, we work on some of these inconsistencies. We are forever trying to get people to recognize inconsistencies and address them at all levels, you know, at the grassroots and at the grass tops. We work in Maryland, so we're close to the nation's capital. I have an easy metro ride down to the Capitol and spent more hours there than I would like to spend, some of which have been very interesting and fine, and some of which have been very frustrating. But we are, as a nation, full of inconsistencies, and maybe the final one I will mention is that we assess everything having to do with children, their teachers, their principals. The only thing we don't assess is how good our standards are. We place a lot of faith in our standards, and we don't assess them. We have the Common Core state standards coming in now in most states, and I was recently at a hearing about these down in South Carolina, and the question was raised, how will you know if they succeed? And the person speaking on behalf of the standards said, well, in 13 years we'll know. And I thought, 13 years. There is absolutely no built-in evaluation of the standards. We have to wait for the first kindergarten children to work their way all through school. And then we'll probably say, well, you can't tell with the first group. You have to wait, you know, a few more years. So we're talking 15, 20 years of standards that were never pre-tested. And, you know, talk about risk. I consider that a high level of risk, in fact, an unacceptable level of risk on behalf of children. So on the one hand, we're risk averse. On the other hand, we go diving into one pot of risk after another on a big scale. But I was thinking today, I looked at your list of graduates from Wellesley, this wonderful list, and then I saw photos of so many out here in the hall. It was great. But thinking about Madeleine Albright and Hillary Clinton, 2 of the graduates who, of course, were secretaries of state, and you talk about a high-risk job, you're bound to fail in at least half your efforts for world peace. You're lucky if you feel you've succeeded in a few. And yet there they were, these stalwart souls, willing to take those risks on our behalf, willing to try to negotiate in the Mideast, which is really a trouble spot, and negotiate here and there and everywhere. And I admire them and now John Kerry and other secretaries of state enormously. I think it's much easier to declare war than it is to promote peace. And that it is a risk. And are we willing to take risks? I was reminded, as I thought about them and the work that they did, I'm especially interested in the Middle East, but I was reminded of Jimmy Carter. And during his presidency, he was able to bring together a very important meeting with Anwar Sadat from Egypt and Menahem Begin from Israel. And I tried to read whatever I could at the time about that meeting. And an interesting thing was that how did that come about? How did these 2 men from Egypt and Israel, at a time when the countries had no contact with each other, even agree to come together? And Sadat described how he was giving a talk in Egypt, and I'm sure the hall was filled, and from the back of the hall during the question time, he said a young man stood up, bearded young man, and said to him, because he'd been talking about Israel, have you ever tried to talk with the Israelis? And he realized he had never tried to talk with the Israelis, not with Sadat, with Begin or anyone else. And so I can only picture him sort of picking up the phone, but through all the complex channels that one goes through with all of that, he ended up in a conversation with Begin, and the result of that then was that Jimmy Carter brought both of them to the US for several days of peace talks. It came to be known as the Camp David Accord, and the account that I read of it was that they met there at Camp David in Maryland, and things were not going well at all. It looked like on the Monday when they would end it that they would walk away with nothing. But then an interesting thing happened. And on the Friday, they couldn't meet because it was the Islamic holy day. And on the Saturday, they couldn't meet because it was the Jewish holy day. And on Sunday, they couldn't meet because it was the Christian holy day. And so Sunday night, finally, they got back together, and then things began to move. And by the time they left on Monday, they had the Camp David Peace Accord, which is still in place. Israel and Egypt have not gone to war with each other since. And I think that was around 1978 or so. So I have a high regard for people who put themselves into that level of risk, that level of social risk. I mean, Jimmy Carter already was having enough trouble in his presidency. He didn't need to take that chance. He didn't need to risk everything on trying to bring about peace. But he did it. And I think that many of our, let's say, older generation, they grew up with risk as a normal part of life. It wasn't such a big deal to take risks. My own childhood, we were let out to play. You know, we had the illusion, at least, that our parents had no idea where we were, and we played for hours with each other. We'd get on our bikes and ride and go wherever we wanted. There was a strong sense of safety and of confidence. Confidence that children could handle what came their way. And that confidence doesn't really exist today. And children feel it, and it puts them on shaky ground that the adults around them don't have confidence in them. And it's not that the world is actually less safe for the children. The statistics don't indicate that it's more dangerous for children today than it was back then in the 40s, 50s, 60s. But our confidence in the world has been shaken. And that translates over to wanting to keep our children as safe as possible. In England, the play workers, I'll say a little more about them, but these are a quirky lot that do a lot to support play in children. They say the goal is not to give children as little risk as possible, but to give them as much risk as they can handle. To give them as much risk as they can handle. We still have a long way to go in this country before we're comfortable with such a thought. But what does it look like when families and schools try to give children more risk? Let me talk about that. First of all, let's think about the gesture, especially in the family, of raising a child. You know, you think of the little newborn held very close to the heart, very close to the human home here, you know, held snugly in one's arms. And as the child begins to walk, you kind of give them a little more space, you know, and then a little more space. They go off to preschool, they go off to kindergarten, they go off to school. You know, every step of the way, you're there for them, but you give them a little more space. And last year I went back to my high school for a high school reunion, and I was struck again by the physical gesture of the school. It's quite majestic. It's named after P.S. DuPont, so they tried to make it DuPont majestic. It's a beautiful school, and it has two big wings that go out, but at the very end of the wings, they turn in a little bit, right? And I've often thought a perfect gesture for adolescents. You're still there, but you're giving them a lot of space. And then traditionally, at least, when I and my friends went off to college, you know, you were given even more space. And by the time we were finished with college, parents had their hands in their pockets, you know, kind of saying, okay, now, out into the world. It's very different now for young people. And some of us were talking at lunch today that even at the graduate school level, parents are on the phone with the head of graduate programs complaining about this or that. I've talked to business people who say once they've decided to hire a young person, the parents get strongly involved in all the negotiations about salary and benefits and so on. And it was so frustrating to one businessman. He said, I just tell them now to bring their parents to the interview. Because he said, we don't get anywhere anyway without the parents, because every time I try to work things out with the young person, their parents interfere with it, so I might as well just deal with the parents, right? Where is this? It's not really there anymore. But even when the children are growing up, one has a sense that this intimate gesture just keeps getting extended as the children get bigger, but not actually with an opening. There's a fearfulness that if we let the children go, they won't know how to handle themselves. They won't know how to cope with the world. And the problem is, if you don't give them a chance, they don't know how to cope with the world. They don't know how to risk assess. They don't know how to handle themselves. Well, in the Alliance for Childhood, we were very concerned about these issues. And so we commissioned a small study where a woman in Texas who had run several adventure playgrounds in Houston interviewed the heads of adventure playgrounds in California. And then we also looked at reports from Europe and Canada and so on. Now, adventure playgrounds grew up in World War II and in the years after. During World War II in Denmark, they noticed an increase in juvenile delinquency. Denmark was overrun by the Germans, and juvenile delinquency was on the rise. And they consulted with a landscape architect, Sorensen, who had designed a lot of playgrounds before the war. And the Danes are very interesting people. So here they are concerned about juvenile delinquency. They don't talk about building prisons, they talk about building playgrounds. So they asked him to help them design some new playgrounds. And he went around and looked at the playgrounds he had designed before the war and found there were no children there. And so then he went to find where are the children playing, and they were playing wherever there had been bombings and wherever there was rubble to be played with. That's what they wanted to play with. So he created what he called a junk playground that just had stuff, now known as loose parts, just stuff. Hammers and nails were made available, planks, stones, whatever was around, and children could build and create, in essence, create their own play area. And there was what was then called them wardens, I've forgotten now, but there was a person there who later became known as a play worker. And after the war, a woman from England, a landscape architect, Lady Almon of Hurtwood, went over to Denmark, saw these playgrounds, and was so impressed that she brought the impulse back, where it grew enormously. There was a time not long ago when London itself had 200 adventure playgrounds. That's been reduced to about 80, but they're all over the UK. So these playgrounds have lots of loose parts. They have some built equipment that's sort of been designed for the spot. They have a shed or a little building that can be opened and more things brought out. And a lot of them are what I call a hammer and nails playground, where children build their own structures. There's one in Berkeley down by the marina that's over 30 years old. And if you go there, you'll see one-story structures that the children have built, two-story structures. And if you get to Switzerland, visit one outside Zurich where you'll see three-story structures. And these are not neat and tidy structures. These look like very ramshackle huts. And I was a little concerned the first time I went to an adventure playground that these were going to fall down on a child's head, and so I shook one. And have you ever seen children build? They use so many nails. This thing did not shake, it was not going anywhere. And in fact, when it's time to take some down to create more space for buildings, the play workers use chainsaws and just cut them off at the base and then have wonderful bonfires with the wood. And developers often will drop off unused wood from a project and so on. So there's a steady stream of new wood that comes in. The biggest risk that they find is that children may step on nails on the ground. And therefore, the one quite strict rule is children have to wear real shoes and keep them on their feet. No flip-flops, no sandals. And in Berkeley, if you want to check out a hammer and nails, you've got to deposit 5 nails in the tin can, nails that you picked up off the ground to keep this, reasonably safe. In over 30 years, Berkeley has had 1 lawsuit only, and it was for a fairly minor injury. We found that in interviewing the directors of adventure playgrounds in California, the 2 of them had had 1 lawsuit each, the third had had none. The injury rates are considered to be very low on adventure playgrounds, probably lower than on conventional playgrounds, but the data is not strong enough to really support that statement. But what we do know is that insurance companies do not charge parks districts extra for having an adventure playground, even though children are playing with hammers and nails and so on, because they have found that the injury rate is very low. And also, what we were told was, if you're a parks district and you have a swimming pool, you probably have plenty of insurance to cover an adventure playground. They're just not considered very dangerous, although most people, when they hear about them, assume they're very dangerous. So why aren't they? The opportunities for risk are pretty high. There's zip lines, and then there's all this building going on, and there's barrels and hills that you roll down, and all sorts of things that you would never find on a traditional playground. But again, it's because when children see real risk, they rise to it. They know what to do. They approach it, most of them approach it cautiously. They test. When they build these buildings, the play workers tell us, they'll put in some nails and then they'll shake it to make sure it's safe. They test as they go. And that's certainly been my experience as a teacher. I taught 3 to 6-year-olds for about 18 years. And I let the children do a lot, more than I'm willing to admit tonight, especially back in the 70s when you could do more. You could let children do more. But, I know we probably used 1 box of Band-Aids over 18 years, but I don't think we used 2 boxes. There just weren't many injuries. And yet children used tools, they climbed trees, sometimes very high in trees. They did all sorts of things, whatever basically they wanted to do, as long as I didn't feel they were really endangering themselves, and they rarely ever went out of bounds about things that they took on. Sometimes socially, they were a little out of bounds, but not in terms of physical risk. Children are amazingly canny at knowing what they can do and assessing what the external world is sort of calling for. If you think of it, if you're trying to cross a busy street, right, and maybe there's not a light there, so you have to kind of gauge, when can I do this? When I was younger, I would take bigger chances on it. If you slow down as you get older, you're not going to take the same chances. You're going to wait for a bigger break. If you're young, you don't need much of a break, and you just run across. It's the same thing all through life. We're always assessing what can we do, and what is the external world saying, calling for. And that goes for busy streets, it goes for tornadoes, it goes for war zones, it goes for anything that's the least bit risky. We are always risk assessing. If we didn't, we would have died out as a species a long time ago. We have an incredible capacity for risk assessment, but we often don't give children a chance to develop that. So when they meet risk at first, and I've talked to people from adventure playgrounds about this, well, what happens when the child comes who hasn't risk assessed? Well, we keep an eye on them because it takes them a couple weeks and then they get the hang of it. And then they're usually fine. Some of them are very timid, some of them take too many chances, but it levels out after a couple weeks. They get the hang of it. So a couple weeks is not a big deal in a child's life. A lot of these things can be restored after we've worked so hard to take play away or take risk away. It can be brought back to the children again. Some of you may have seen the article last month in the Atlantic Monthly by Hannah Rosen called The Overprotected Kid. And if you haven't, I'm sure it's still online or we have it on our website. in the Facebook section. It's an excellent article. And Hannah Rosen's a freelance writer. She's in Washington, D.C., and she went over to England to visit adventure playgrounds. And she actually came just a few weeks after I was there last October, at the time, we thought she would also be, she went to the one in North Wales called The Land, which I visited, and I'll talk about in a moment. But we also thought she was going to one in the East End of London called Glamis, which is one of my favorite adventure playgrounds. So I was there at Glamis and talking with Mark Holden, the director, about Hannah Rosen's upcoming visit. And I said, look, she's bringing her son. He's 5 years old. He probably has never been to an adventure playground. He may not have much experience with risk. I think you need to keep a little bit of an eye on him, because the worst thing would be if he got really injured on your playground, and she's writing about this for The Atlantic. And he said, yeah, we'll keep an extra eye open, but I'm sure he'll be fine. Well, they never made it to Glamis, but they made it to The Land, which is a truly wild-looking adventure playground. There's a little YouTube video about The Land, and eventually there'll be a full documentary about it. But you can look for it on YouTube. And it harkens back to the days when these adventure playgrounds were called junk playgrounds. It's quite junky. These are for elementary age children now, not so much for young children. If it's a young child, the parent stays nearby usually. But so here's Hannah Rosen with her 5-year-old son, and the way she describes it in the article is that a 7-year-old sort of took him under his wing and introduced him to everything in the playground. And at the end of their time there, the 5-year-old sees that you can roll down this hill in a barrel, and there's a creek at the bottom. And she says of her own son, he's the sort of finicky child who doesn't even like to get some drops of water on his sleeve. And the 7-year-old says to him, now look, you can roll down the hill in the barrel, and I'll try to keep you from going into the creek, but you might go in. And her son says, oh, that's okay. And in fact, he did land in the creek and was completely fine about it, right? And it really tickled me, and because here I had been worrying about Hannah Rosen and her 5-year-old son at an adventure playground, but he was fine, thanks to the 7-year-old who took him on. And I see that again and again with children. Something relaxes in them when you really give them a chance to play freely. And they take chances, and they have some sense of what they can handle and what they can't. So I wanted to give you an example from my own classroom days. So I had mixed age groups of 3 to 6-year-olds. So by this time, by spring, the oldest ones were getting ready for first grade. And I had a fairly big boy named Peter, who was quite capable. And one day we went to the creek, and every week we went to the creek, but usually I went to a little tributary where they could easily build dams across the creek. But on this day, I decided to stay at the main part of the creek, which was not super deep, but probably a foot or a little bit more, and much wider. And in the middle of it, there was a big rock, which we had never explored before. But now Peter, 6-year-old Peter, says to me, I want to jump out on the rock, and then my friends are going to hand me stones, and I'm going to build a dam. We're going to build a dam on this half of the creek. And I'm looking at this stone, and I'm thinking, no way is he going to be able to jump to that stone. Let's see. Certainly it was, I would say, from here to there that he had to jump. And I'd never seen him jump that far. And I was about to say no, but the beautiful thing is, as a parent or teacher, you can practice saying yes when it comes to children wanting to take a chance. Automatically, we tend to say no, but we can actually discipline ourselves to stop and think about it. And I didn't just automatically say yes, though. I had to really think about it. I had to risk assess. And my thinking went like this. I don't think he's going to make it. I think he's going to fall in the creek. But it's a very warm day. Our school is 2 blocks away. We have dry clothes over there. And most important, his mother is raising 2 sons and is very relaxed about these things. So if I send him home with other clothes, she's not going to worry about it. So I told him he could do it, and he was a little surprised that I was going to let him. But he really, I watched him, really getting ready for this jump. And then he made this beautiful leap over to the stone, and then he had to really find his balance, and he found it. And then for the next, whatever it was, 30, 40 minutes that we were there, he'd reach way out, and his friends would reach way out and hand him stones, and they built up this little dam. And they were so satisfied at the end, and he leaped back, and we went to school, and you know what? Nobody had even a wet shoe on their feet. They had managed that whole thing so beautifully, and it taught me a lot about what 6-year-olds can do. They often have a very good sense of balance by that age. So a different thing is that I had a group of 6-year-old boys. I also worked with girls, but in this instance it was a group of boys in the classroom who had been very good players, but in this winter, spring, it was like they fell out of play. They didn't know what to do with themselves. And I have a number of tricks in my pockets over the years, but I could not seem to help them. They just were a mess. And when you get a group of 5 or 6 of these older children who aren't playing well, it can make a mess of your whole room. So socially, we were having difficulties that week. And then towards the end of the week, it was pouring rain, and we didn't have the right rain gear, and we were going to stay in for the second playtime. And I was thinking, what can we do? What can we do? And one of the children over snack began to talk about the circus being in town. And I said, oh, we could have a circus. And they said, we could? What could we do? And we often had little obstacle courses and things like that that I called the circus. But on this occasion, I heard myself saying, we could have the high wire act. They were astonished, but not as astonished as I was. And I'm sitting there thinking, Joan, what are you talking about? And they're looking at me and saying, how can we do that? And I'm thinking, right, how can we do that? You find yourself in these predicaments sometimes as a teacher, probably as a parent too. So we cleaned up as quickly as we could after snack, and then took our 2 big tables, put them end to end, but with a gap about this big between, so a couple feet. And I took a plank that was maybe 3 feet long and put it over that gap and put a big stump on each end of the plank to kind of anchor it. And meanwhile, these big boys had gathered around to watch what I was doing. And then they said in a sort of baffled tone of voice, we can't do that. And I thought, oh, that's strange. They're 6. They should have enough balance to be able to walk this plank. But I just said, well, I'll help you. It's okay. And so they climbed up on the table one at a time and got on the plank, and I gave them both hands, and they held as tight as they could as they crossed that plank. And each one did it 2 or 3 times, holding really tight. And then they began to say, well, not say, but they just began to loosen their grip, right? And then they said, 1 hand, okay? And then after a few times, no hands, okay? Then they were going forwards, and then they were going backwards. Then they were doing it with their eyes closed, and then they were hopping across. I don't think they ever got to hop backwards. That would seem to be too much for them. But they did everything they could think of on this plank. And after that, they played. Because it was like something was stuck in them. They didn't know what they could do until they were given a chance to do it. And I've seen this. I learned from that, and I used it again and again when children were stuck. I would give them a slightly risky thing to do, and they would come unstuck and start moving on. Just one other example, a little girl who entered the class in January, and when I met her a month before, I thought, oh, she'll do okay. Some children, it's hard for them to enter in the middle of the year. And she was a young 5 and didn't seem excessively shy, and I thought she would be fine. But in fact, when she started with us, she wasn't fine. She didn't interact with the children. She didn't really participate in what we were doing. And I was concerned about how to help her, and I couldn't quite find that magic key for her. And then we had a big snowstorm, and the children were so happy playing out in the snow. And in Washington or Maryland, where I live, usually the snow only stays for about a week, and then it melts. So the playground had no more snow, but there was a big bank of it along the end of the parking lot where the snow shovels had pushed it. And my older children asked if they could play on that snow. And we had a strict rule about not going into the parking lot. And so I said to them, you can play on the snow, but you can't walk on the parking lot. You have to walk on the snow. And it was very up and down and rough and icy and all sorts of things, but they had the balance and they could manage. And then this little 5-year-old girl wanted to play with them, And I decided, I could have easily taken her by the hand across the parking lot, but I decided not to do that. And I said, you can play with them, but you have to go on the snow. No, I want to go on the parking lot. No, if you can stay in the playground, or you can go on the snow and get to them, because they were at the far end. Well, the first day she only got about that far, right? And the next day she got a little further. And by the third day she had found her balance and had mastered this mound of snow and joined the other children, and the snow lasted another few days and they played there. And you know what happened then? She was fine. Then she began to play with everyone, she began to participate in everything in the class. It was as if she had found her confidence. And this is what I see in children who can handle themselves physically or socially and who can take risks, is they have confidence in themselves and in the world around them. And the children who don't know how to handle risk, things are much shakier for them. They're either excessively timid about life or what I would call foolhardy about life. They take unreasonable risks. And there are children like that, and I have followed some of them as they get older, and some of them have had real problems, socially or even with the law, as they get older. They don't quite know where their own boundaries are. They don't quite fit easily into their own bodies. And they don't know how to really navigate themselves through physical space or social space. And so now if I was teaching, I would take much more seriously the children who have difficulty risk assessing, because I have seen that it can be an indicator of something else. I don't know what to call that something else. Something I'd love to work with psychologists or others on. What is that makes it difficult for some children, not many in my experience, but some children to risk assess? So on the one hand, most children are really good at risk assessing, and they know how far to go. Sometimes children are at a little bit of a loss, and you need to just help them a bit. But what I don't like doing is like taking a child and putting them up in the tree, for instance. If they haven't climbed the tree, they don't know how to climb down from the tree, and that's dangerous. But sometimes, like these boys or this little girl, you just need to prompt them a bit, and then they're fine. So what does this have to do with success? Is it possible to be successful in this world without taking chances? I suppose in some limited areas of life. But, again, if you think of statesmen and women, if you think of presidents, if you think of CEOs, if you think of anyone with an entrepreneurial nature, how do they succeed without taking risks? Business people take risks all the time. Sometimes they win, sometimes they lose, right? And they know how to bounce back when things don't go right. They know they have also a pocket full of tricks. Well, that didn't work, let's try it this way. It's like the scientist in the lab. Not everything works out. But you take a chance, you have a hypothesis, which is a big chance, and you test it, and it may work and it may not work. But along the way, you learn an enormous amount. And that's what happens to children when you give them a chance. You give them opportunities to take risk, and they learn enormously. I've had people who have said to me, "What? You gave real needles to 3-year-olds to sew with? Didn't they prick themselves?" And my answer was, "Oh yes, once. That was all it took." Now the real danger of giving a thread and needle to a 3-year-old is they have no idea what's happening out here. So the big risk was for the child sitting next to them, not for them. So you give them a short thread, But you learn these things with children. But children learn so fast when they really meet the world, and then they have a bump, they have an injury, and most of them learn very quickly what they can do, what they can't do at this stage. And then at the next stage, they do more. And that assumes that we keep opening our arms wider, still there, vigilant, watching, caring, concerned sometimes, but we keep giving them more and more freedom to test the world. And of course, teenagers need a lot of freedom to test the world. And they need caring adults who are there to support them in doing it. They don't need adults who do it all for them. They need to feel confident in themselves and to test that confidence. But it begins when they're little, that we have confidence that they can test themselves against the world. And the biggest advice I can give on this is watch the children, observe them. It's astonishing how capable they are, how able they are to risk assess and then to move forward. And I think it's that confidence, that ability to meet the challenges of life that really, that lead ultimately to success. I suppose a lot depends on how we define success. But for me, it means having a fairly balanced life and always moving forward. I have found over the years that young children sort of awaken to math and get very interested. And in particular, I have found girls get very interested in infinity. I have observed many interesting conversations between girls about infinity, some of which were so complex I couldn't really begin to remember them. But the one I do remember was a 6-year-old and a 5-year-old speaking, and the 5-year-old said, "I know what infinity is. It's 6,318. And the 6-year-old looked at her with scorn and said, "That's not infinity. Infinity means keep going." And I always thought that was really good for infinity and for a lot of other things in life. You know, the children have this sense, they're growing, they just need to keep going. They need to keep expanding their boundaries. They keep needing to test themselves against that world around them. And if they make a mistake, okay, big deal. Think of a child learning to walk. How many mistakes do they make? How often do they fall? It's not many children who wait until they can run across a room to get up the first time on their feet, right? They try, they fall, they try, they fall. I would never use the word failure about a young child. It's just part of the process. And that really goes on all through those growing years. And then we get more conservative about it as adults, or some adults. But I would just say this, that living in a college town, which I do, where the University of Maryland is, and I've been there for 37 years, I'm quite appalled at the risks I see young people take in terms of alcohol and drugs. It's as if they have no sense of healthy boundaries anymore. I'm not saying that my generation didn't experiment, but we did have some sense of boundaries. And I think so many of these young people grew up without real risk, without learning where the boundaries were, where the dangers were. And it just seems like those kinds of usages are just escalating for them, and it concerns me deeply. And I think that one of the antidotes is really to give young children risk and let them deal with it, let them get on with it, let them learn from risk. And then they have a sense, socially and physically, of how to handle risk as they get older. Well, one last thing is that when we did the survey of adventure playgrounds, and we've captured the results of it in this booklet called Adventure, the Value of Risk in Children's Play. And this is available, the introduction is on our website, but the full booklet's available through Amazon. When we did the survey that this is based on, we asked about 3 big questions. It had to do with what I mentioned before: insurance, injury, lawsuits. And what we learned here and abroad and in Canada was the injury rates were very low, the lawsuits were very few, and the insurance companies were unconcerned. And that was important to us because we're always talking to parks departments in particular about adventure playgrounds, and these are the 3 things they always bring up. But I think it's indicative of something bigger, that, that we're also worried about these things. Of course, nobody wants to see a child injured, but I remember at New York Parks Department had a wonderful commissioner, Adrian Benepe, and a few years ago he was on a panel about this, and he said, "We need a revolution in play, and it's going to start here now. And if a child climbs a tree and falls and breaks their arm, well then so be it." And I thought, I couldn't believe I was hearing a commissioner of parks say something like that. But he was really a great and adventuresome soul. He's now not with the New York Parks, but with some other big parks nonprofit. And yeah, that's, you know, in England they say if a child, and I don't want to dwell on broken bones, but if a child breaks a bone while playing, that is not the same as if an adult breaks a bone in a workplace. If that happens in a workplace, you really have to figure out what's wrong with this workplace. It should not be that hazardous. But when a child breaks an arm, let's say, while playing, it's just, it happens. It happens. I have a young cousin here in Boston with 7-year-old twins, and we were at his local park, and the children played beautifully, and on all the equipment. They were very agile that day, but 2 weeks later, one of them fell off the thing and broke his arm. It happens. And 6 weeks later, the cast came off and everything was fine. It happens. And fortunately, much more serious injuries don't happen. That we have to really guard against. And hazards we have to guard against. Because hazards are the things children can't risk assess for. A hazard is there's a big grassy field, but there's broken glass in the middle, and the child doesn't know it's there. They could be injured on that. If there's a piece of equipment that's poorly designed or broken, children can't risk assess for that, and so they can be really injured. Most injuries on playgrounds come because the equipment's not right. So, you know, there are things to guard against that are our job, but not the everyday risks of children's play. That's their job, to risk assess. We can stand back, we can be conscious, we can be aware, but mostly we can be supportive and we can be trustful. That this is part of growing up, or meeting the challenges of life. They come in small ways when you're little, and they come in big ways when you're big, but you work your way up to the big by facing the challenges when you're little. I'd like to stop here and give you all a chance to talk and ask questions, and we have a couple of mics, so I hope that you'll take advantage of that.
Are they on? Is this on? Yeah. We have 2 mics set up, so if people would like to get up and ask questions, they could get to either mic, and we'd be happy to answer those questions.
I hope you have questions or comments or concerns. It doesn't have to be a question. Feel free.
I have a question.
Hi.
It seems from your talk that you see a direct connection between physical risk-taking in childhood and what I would characterize as more intellectual risk-taking when you're Secretary of State, for example. And if so, what I'm wondering is, how do you think that process unfolds? Do you see the same fundamental mechanism driving risk assessment in physical challenges for childhood and intellectual challenges later on?
I love that question.
Thank you.
Do you want to add more to it?
No,
okay.
Please.
All right. So you're reminding me of Ashley Montagu, who was a well-known anthropologist, and he talked about children's play being in a direct line of ascent to the scientist in the lab. That the same sort of what if I try it this way, what if I build this way, is what the scientist goes through in thinking, well, what if I structure the experiment this way? What if I ask the question or build the hypothesis this way? You know, he saw a direct line of ascent. And I saw this played out beautifully in my classroom one day. A very bright 6-year-old fellow, Keenan, he was building a car, which we built often. I had the peculiar belief as a teacher that the kindergarten was the one place where you should reinvent the wheel every day. So I didn't give the children anything with wheels other than the carpet sweeper, and I can assure you we had the cleanest carpet in town, because children do love wheels. But they would just invent their own cars, and they usually took a stump or several stumps, laid them on their side, and put a plank on top. Planks are wonderful to have in classrooms. And then 3 or 4 children could sit on this car and kind of move it along, you know, and periodically the plank would separate from the stumps and they would have to get off and adjust it, but they were used to that. That was no big deal. But on this day, Keenan was playing by himself and he'd created a car, and now he was trying to steer the car. So he had our basket of ropes, and he was tying ropes onto the plank, he was tying ropes onto the stumps. He couldn't get it. I tried my hand at it, and I realized this is beyond me. I'm backing out of here and letting him work at it. For 45 minutes, he tried this every way he could think of. And meanwhile, his friend Stephen kept running over and saying, Keenan, we're playing such and such, over here. No, he was focused. And finally, he decided it just wasn't working, which it wasn't. I think he needed a steering column and an axle. And that was things we didn't provide in the classroom. So he just kind of shrugged and dropped the ropes and went off and played with Stephen. Well, a few weeks later, I was, the end of snack, we had been churning butter that morning, and I was now paddling the butter to get the whey off of it. And he was standing at my elbow watching me. And he said to me, when you put the cream in the butter churn, it was white, and now the butter is yellow. Why? And I always tried to be honest with children, as much as I could be, given their ages and so on. And so I said to him, I've noticed that often, but I have no idea why it turns yellow in the butter churn. And then he just stood there, and you could practically feel the thoughts going around. And I could just see him with those ropes, and that stump and that plank. And now he was doing it just in his mind. And he said, I know why. He said, you see, the cream came from a cow, and the cow eats grass, and the grass is green, and green is made of blue and yellow. And that's where the yellow comes from. And the darndest thing is, he turned out to be right. I don't know if any of you have had cows, I haven't, but when I told the story, a mother said, I have cows, I've made a lot of butter, he's absolutely right. In the summer, when they're out in the meadow eating grass, you get this beautiful summery yellow butter, and in the winter, when they're in the barn eating hay, you get white butter. And then I remembered how Laura Ingalls Wilder's mother would grate carrot and to put some yellow coloring into the winter butter because the grass has keratin in it. And it's that keratin that makes the butter turn yellow. So do I see a direct connection between how children do things this way and how they think? Yes. And I can give you one other example that wonderful play advocate Stuart Brown has in his book, which is called Play. And he talks about the aerospace lab in Southern California, which has been in the leadership of the whole aerospace industry. And that in the late 90s, a lot of the older engineers were retiring, and the lab was hiring new engineers, young ones from MIT, Stanford, and so on, very bright young people. And they had lots of good ideas, but when they ran into problems, they didn't know how to problem solve. And he was getting very discouraged and frustrated because he could see that the quality of the lab was going to go down if they didn't know how to solve the problems that were coming up in their work. And then he read an article by somebody in a different field but who had faced the same problem, and what that person found was that if he hired young people who had tinkered when they were young, they knew how to problem solve. So tinkering is when you take the toaster apart and put it together and have several pieces left over, and now you have to problem solve to figure out what those pieces are and how to put them in. In my day, you went from toasters to various things and ended up with cars, but nowadays it's a lot harder to tinker with cars because of all the computer stuff that's in them. But what the lab started doing was, on the application, they asked, did you tinker? And then in the interviews, they asked that. And so they continued to hire very bright young engineers, but only the ones who had tinkered, because they knew how to problem solve. And tinkering is a form of play. So again, it's this line of ascent from, dealing with things, right? Playing with things, imagining with things, and then dealing with ideas, playing with ideas, imagining your way into ideas, and seeing them from different angles. And I think there's a very strong connection, very strong. Please.
Hi, Joan.
Hi.
And you're such a wonderful speaker. I heard your talk, and I recommend people. There's a talk she gave at the 92nd Street Y that's on YouTube. Check it out. It's just wonderful. I don't even know how to ask this question, so I guess I'll just play around with it. What are your thoughts on children who are growing up in environments that are actually dangerous, where the problem is not creating intentional risk, but children who are growing up, as I think more and more children in America are, sadly, facing real risks. And their parents are becoming, and must be, acutely aware of the difficulty of protecting their children, of creating safe spaces, when in fact they're not living in safe spaces. So the problem is there's tons of risk. And I'm wondering your thoughts for what we can do, for how you think about risk for children who are in fact living in dangerous environments, and what your thoughts are. I mean, obviously huge, but I mean, we're not going to solve it tonight. But about the issue of risk in risky spaces for young children.
That's a great question. So my own experiences, I have not worked in a refugee camp, and when I look at those conditions, I'm, horrified, as I think most of us are. So I can't speak about risk in that situation, but I have worked in townships in South Africa. I've done some work in homeless shelters. I've worked in inner city schools that are surrounded by drugs and so on. And I would say the best protection that parents can give, and they kind of know this, is just their own love that they can put around their children. They often can't do what's needed for the physical protection. The circumstances are really difficult for them to do that. They do their best, but it's not what we, let's say, as middle-class families would consider to be adequate. But they can put love around. And that is not to be kind of taken for granted or minimized, because children feel that strongly, and it serves as a sort of protective force. I thought one of the most profound parts of the Harry Potter books was at the end of volume 1. All through that volume, the question keeps getting asked when Voldemort, the evil being, came and killed Harry's parents, why was he unable to kill Harry? Harry was left with a kind of lightning mark on his forehead, but he survived that attack. And at the end of the book, it said, and I imagine it's probably Dumbledore who says it, it's the wise figure in the books, the love of Harry's mother was like a protective skin around Harry, that danger could not enter. It could not affect him as it would have if he had not been so intensely loved. So I have a friend, for instance, who's done a lot of work with homeless families out in the San Francisco area. And I was so moved when she told me about a session she had done with mothers and children, but especially with the mothers, on how to do a bedtime ritual when you're putting your children to sleep in the car at night. Right? It was not in her realm of possibility to take those families out of the car and give them a good shelter. But she could at least help the mothers create a shelter around their children with lullabies and bedtime stories and all the things one does to help children enter into the nightlife. And she taught them how to do that in their cars. And later she was able to work in more advanced ways, let's say, with families. And people out there were astonished because all the families she worked with, none of them went back to being homeless, which is an astonishing thing in itself. But it was largely out of building up this protective, loving gesture around the children. And that is something that parents can do. And I've seen parents in really terrible situations, like in the townships at first. When I first went over, apartheid had just come to an end. And I was shown one child care center for infants and toddlers, and there were maybe 12 children in a fairly small room, and they were all sleeping on mats, which, just like a blanket on the floor, which for us is too little, right? And our inspectors would never allow it, and so on. But when I commented about it to my friend who was working as an advisor, she said, yeah, but Joan, you have to understand that before the children came here, they were tied to their beds all day while their mothers went to work because the mothers had no other option, right? And I've, talked with and seen video footage and so on from a play worker from England who went to Romania and worked with children in a hospital where the children were tied to their beds all day because there was maybe one staff person for dozens and dozens of children. But the play workers began to take the children out of the beds and let them play for a couple hours a day. And, within a month, the children were playing. It took a little while. But I think that almost wherever you are, there's something you can do that makes life better for children. And I'm often reminded of the story of Sleeping Beauty, where if you remember it, the king has only 12 golden plates, and so one of the wise women has to be left at home at the time of the feast. And then the wise women give these good wishes to the baby, and after the 11th has given her wish, the 13th comes in, who is furious over not being invited to the feast. And in a loud voice she says, in her 15th year she shall prick her finger with a spindle and fall down dead. And there's this hush, and then she turns and leaves. And then the story says, but the 12th wise woman had not yet made her wish. And she came forward. She could not take away the evil spell, but she could soften it. And she said, there shall be no death, but a deep sleep of 100 years, into which the child shall fall. And then the story continues. But this line about she could not take away the evil spell, but she could soften it, has been my experience consistently in life. That when it comes to children, we can't always lift the problem off their shoulders. We can't necessarily take them out of the cars and put them in a home. But we can soften what they're experiencing. So I feel like some children need to experience more. That's what I've been talking mainly about tonight. And some children are already experiencing far too much. And we need to create a bit of a buffer that we can do emotionally around the child. And children feel that. I am convinced of that. Children feel our concern, they feel our love, and they feel protected by that. So at the very least, that we can do for children. Someone else. Yes, please.
I noticed that you very carefully and rightfully avoided the word failure with young children. But my concern is that the society as a whole does not tolerate failure. And to me, that is very much related to society's tolerance of children taking risk. That parents want everything to be perfect and right and for their children, and so in an effort to do that, they try to avoid risk because they don't want their children to experience failure. So where in your lectures or dealing with the public and legislators does this concept of a child's need to experience failure, if you will, another way to say it is experimentation, risk, all of those things, where is that concept in your conversations?
Yeah, thank you for that. Well, what I have found is that adults do understand about failure in the business world. They understand about it in the scientific world. I mean, we know about the medicines that have succeeded and gone through all the FDA tests. We don't hear about all the failures, right? But it's built into many of the complex processes of life, is that you're going to try something and it doesn't work. And then you're going to try it a different way. And it may still not work, and then you're going to try it a different way. This time it worked. And so what I have found really helpful is to remind people of that, because they do understand that process of experimentation in other realms. And they absolutely see it in the lives of young children who are learning to walk. It's just very clear to them all the times that a child falls, while they're in the process of learning to walk. I wouldn't call that a failure, I would just call it a process. And I think it's also a process in the business world and in the scientific world. So I have exactly what point I would call something a failure, I'm not sure. I sometimes joke that the Alliance takes on impossible missions and we fail. But in fact, I know we're not failing, because then 5 or 10 years later, I see it come back around, you know, in a different way. It's like we're planting seeds, and we're breaking ground, and then eventually the thing comes up. Just as a little digression, high-stakes testing is a good example, because with No Child Left Behind, we worked so hard to try to get Congress to build in a protection for children against high-stakes use of testing, and we failed. We did not get it. But the group we worked with, Fair Test, went on working in that area, and they now have a coalition of over 800 groups that are concerned about high-stakes testing. So at what point do we actually say that something is a failure rather than part of a process? When the daffodils I looked at today died, was that a failure on their part, or was it part of the process of life? You know, that they were making way and now the tulips are coming, right? And then the next thing comes, and the next thing comes, and then come the frosts of the fall and everything kind of goes under again. At what point is something a failure, and at what point is it part of a life process? And I honestly don't know where those lines are. You know, I mean, world peace, you could absolutely say is a failure, except I'm not willing to give up on it yet. It's part of processes, it's part of growing as human beings. And by and large, I find that people do understand that. The problem comes in practicing it, or putting it into practice. And when it comes to children, my experience in talking kind of up and down that ladder from congressional members and Department of Education and teachers and principals and superintendents and whoever I can get to listen to these issues, is that they actually do understand it. They often are baffled about what to do about it. And people get locked in. And I live inside the Beltway, which in Washington means something. And it basically means that you're just surrounded by the thinking that goes on in the Capitol all the time. And people, a lot of them would like to break through and create some good changes, and they don't know how. They don't know how to get out of themselves enough, to get out of the way of themselves enough to actually bring about change. So one just keeps encouraging and talking and reminding them of what it means to be a human being that's in a process of growth. And when we're growing, we rise and we fall and then we rise again. I don't know any other process for growing. I don't know a way to just get up and soar. You know, not many creatures even can do that. When I was in New Zealand, I was so impressed by the big, huge white albatrosses that live there and then go on from there. And the life cycle of an albatross is they have a partner and they lay an egg and they are there for 9 months while the egg opens, and they give their young a start, and the young run along paths and they flap their wings to strengthen them, and then they take off and they don't touch land for 2 years. But I don't know of a human being that can just take off the first time they try and not land for 2 years. The albatrosses just go round and round on what they call the roaring 40s, these winds from the southern hemisphere. You know, they dive down and get fish, and they assume that they sleep on the air currents 2 years before they land. But we human beings, we get up and we fall down, and we get up and we fall down. When I was little, there were these pop-up dolls. Do some of you remember these big air-filled dolls? They were round on the bottom and they had weights in the bottom, and you'd knock them over and they'd pop up. And you'd knock them over and pop up. And I think my generation was inspired by pop-up dolls, right? You fall down, you get back up. You fall down, you get back up. You get a little older, you stay down a little longer, then you pop up, right? So somewhere in us as human beings, I think we understand that. I just was reading, there's actually an encyclopedia, the Cambridge Encyclopedia of Hunters and Gatherers. And it says that for 90% of human history, we were hunters and gatherers. We've had a very short history of agriculture, industry, and now technology. And in that short history, maybe the last 30 or 40 years that we've become so concerned about risk, maybe 20 years, I don't know. We had a long period of learning to deal with risk, of learning how to cope with a fairly hostile environment. All of that is in our collective memory as far as I'm concerned. Children just have inherited a wisdom about this, and we all have. And we've just put all these layers of sophisticated, whatever, culture, and that's not even culture, just sophistication on top of it. And sometimes we have to peel through to get to something very basic, which is that we're in a process of growth and evolution, and that involves death and decay as well. That involves falling, that involves failing, and then we rise again. And I think we see it in nature every day, we see it in ourselves, we see it in one another. The children know it very well, and they accept it. We're the ones that have a hard time with it. But how to convince people, I don't know. I just talk about it, and some people get it and some don't, but enough get it that I do see change on the horizon. Mind you, sometimes the horizon feels like it's receding, other times it feels like it's coming closer. I think people are catching on, though, that there's more and more people I meet who sense that we've gone too far in this, specifically in this area of protection, that we are now overprotecting and that it's doing harm. So I think we'll see changes in this area. Certainly in resonance to our report and then Hannah Rosen's article, I see a lot of attention being paid to this issue. Please.
On that note, thank you for this perspective. I have a question about parental risk aversion and overprotection. Certainly parents are sometimes reluctant to let their children take risks because they're afraid for their safety, afraid they'll get hurt, afraid they can't handle it. But it seems to me that there are other times that parents are reluctant to let their kids take risks, even though they think the kids can handle it, even though they're not particularly worried about the kids getting hurt, or they even may take the attitude, well, a broken bone's not the end of the world, but they are fearful of other kinds of repercussions, social risks. At the mild end, other people may think they're bad parents. At the more severe end, the state may judge them to be bad parents. And unlike children on a playground who have good information to make risk assessments, parents have very poor information to make that risk assessment. And so I'm wondering if what are some ways that we can help to increase parents' sense of security, that they are empowered to determine what they should and shouldn't allow for kids in terms of experimentation and risk-taking.
Yeah. One of the most powerful things I've learned to do with parents or any group that I work with when I'm not on a stage and everybody's far away is to have people share their play memories from when they were young. And it's pretty amazing the risks that people took when they were young. And that kind of gets them thinking, oh yeah, my friends and I did that. We actually never really got hurt. I mean, among all my friends, when I've thought back to play, I remember one friend who had a broken leg, and I can't remember at all how she broke it. But nobody else showed any signs of wear and tear of childhood other than a skinned knee here and there. So I think getting parents to remember is very powerful. But I have to say that if they're younger parents, if they're under 30, it's very possible that they didn't play freely very much. Because when we do play memories, we find that people under 30 often had a lot of adult organized activities and not much opportunity for their own play. So, sometimes you can give adults an experience, especially if you're teaching adults, you can give them some risk play experiences, and they begin to see the value of it when they're taking social and physical risks that are appropriate for their age group. A lot of times it's just a question of talking about it, because there's so much fear out there, and fear tends not to be a very conscious thing. That the more light you can shed on fear, the more likely people are to take hold of it and not be dictated by it. Most people do not actually like being dictated by fear. Some people have really serious phobias that's harder to deal with, but mainly what we're talking about is your just normal everyday fear levels that people have about risk. And once they see that they're being manipulated in many ways to be fearful, they don't like that. But your earlier point is well taken, that the social pressures on parents are great. And many parents have told me stories about letting their elementary children out playing and somebody calls the police on them.
My own son has been brought home in a police car from down the street.
Wait, say that again?
My own 7-year-old son was brought home last week in a police car because he walked down the street by himself with my permission.
Okay, so you know what it's like. and that's a kind of social pressure where I haven't had to deal with that, but I would certainly talk with the policeman and say, what made you feel that he was unsafe? What did he say?
No. It was the person who called the policeman. The person who was harassed. The only stranger who harassed my child was the one who pulled over to make sure he was okay and wouldn't leave him alone because she didn't believe he was okay.
Right.
But those risks are not equally distributed among the population. Right. Some parents face much greater risks there of being deemed neglectful of their children. And I guess my question is that a real danger for parents in encouraging this kind of risky play?
A couple of things to that. One is because of these concerns, it's one of the reasons we have gone quite deeply into the whole question of adventure playgrounds and play workers. Because when we first started to work on restoring play, and I would hear stories like this and run into the fear levels, I thought it's going to take a long time to get this sorted out in our culture. And meanwhile, children need to play. And so, we've worked with parks departments and training their staff that even just in their normal programs, they don't have to feel like every minute has to be scheduled. That summer camp, day camp can be an opportunity for play, as well as organized activities. It's not just a one or the other. You have the children with you all day. You've got time to do various things. And the camps and parks departments have found that the children are so much more relaxed and so much happier if they're also given time for free play. And that the parents, rather than being upset, the parks departments initially thought parents would be upset if they gave the children time to play because they wanted them to learn this sport and these skills and these rules and so on. Instead, the parents loved it because they saw how happy the children were. And so, for instance, one parks department had been trying for years to do a winter camp and a spring camp over breaks and never had enough enrollment. After they started to bring play into the summer camp, they had enough enrollment to open these other camps. Even though at first the staff told us this is never going to work, it'll never work, the parents don't want it. But once the parents see it, they get it, and they get how happy their children are. So that is maybe, in answer to the question that the other woman asked before, that's maybe the most compelling way we have found to convince adults about play and risk, is that they actually see how happy their children are when they're given real opportunities for it. It doesn't necessarily help you with a neighbor who is over the top with concern. I think at some other point when she's calmed down, I might go to her and talk with her about, I was aware that he was walking, I gave him permission to do such and such. I feel it's good for him to have a chance to be out there and, within boundaries to meet the world more. But there's, you do have to count on meeting a lot of fear. And I was talking with somebody else the other night on this topic, and she said, well, at the playground, she'll let her children go up the slide, and the other mothers are all in a tizzy because she's letting her child go up the slide instead of just down the slide. And she said, my children never get hurt. They're used to doing all sorts of things. And then, I said, well, maybe just to say to those parents, why don't you just watch and see how they handle it? Because they actually really know what they're doing. Doesn't mean you have to let your children do it. But my children do know how to handle themselves this way, and I think it's good for them. So, we use what opportunities we can to talk, and we hope we won't get arrested in the process. And, I don't know what to say. I know that must have been a very unpleasant experience. I don't want to minimize it. But, okay, good. Yeah, it could have been worse. Yeah, no, there's something to that. So that's also part of risk assessment. That if you were a woman of color and you lived in a working class or a poor neighborhood, that you might not be able to take those chances That's part of risk assessment too. But I would like to recommend a website to you called Playborhood. And a fellow named Mike Lanza out in California has really developed the art of how to make his neighborhood as playful as possible for his own boys, but for all the children in the neighborhood. And he's a good writer, and he does fun things to kind of change the atmosphere in the neighborhood, that it's become very tolerant of children's play at this point. One of the things he did, by the way, was instead of putting all the play equipment in the backyard, he put things in his front yard so parents could see their children playing at his house. And on Fridays after work, he invited parents to come over and sit on the porch and have some beer or wine or whatever they wanted, to get to know him and his wife, so they would feel comfortable with their children coming to his house to play. Things like that. But he's done a good job with his neighborhood. And so it's, working with parks departments is one thing, but transforming our own neighborhoods is another. In my neighborhood, we've really worked hard to have a strong network of households that we're not formally identified, but the children know who we are. There's 8 or 10 households. We get together for parties and Christmas carol singing, and the children would know they could go to any one of us if they needed help. Without question, they would come to one of us. So, you can build neighborhood ties among people too, that children have that sense of, this is a village and I'm protected by all these caring people. It's not just my insular home. And that's how children always grew up, with a sense that there were others. We were in and out of one another's homes growing up, and at this high school reunion, I realized, I knew your parents, I knew your grandparents, I knew your pets, and I knew your siblings. And there's nobody else in this world I can say that about, other than my cousins, right? It's good for children to really, have that sense of being woven into a community. Did you have a question before? No. Oh, okay.
Joan, I wanted to thank you very much.
You are very welcome. Very welcome. Thank you all. Thank you.